Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone here has had an opportunity to see parts 1 through 3. This is part 4 of our series of who would Apostle John likely have believed was at least an Antichrist if Apostle John had read this person's writings. And in part 4, the subject question is this: did Jesus in Hebrew Matthew chapter 24 use Antichrist, the word Antichrist, to mean one in the guise of Jesus who appears pre-temple fall, meaning pre-70 AD? So let's take a look. Now, why should we be thinking that we're going to see in the Hebrew Matthew that's been recovered from what's called the Shem Tab manuscript of the 1300s, and we'll tell you what's the genesis of that in a second. But we would have reason to believe that the Gospels originally did have the word Antichrist in it because of this highlighted yellow word in 1 John 2:18. So again, this is John warning about the Antichrist, one of his 3 passages where he actually does this. And he says, "My children, it is the last hour. And just as you heard that the Antichrist would come, even now many Antichrists have appeared." So I believe we should find somewhere in the Gospels that it exists, but it doesn't exist in any of the Gospels at this time. But interestingly, it does appear in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. So let's take a look at that. So there's my little reminder. Was Antichrist in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24 at one time? And the answer is yes. Now, this is the passage from Matthew 24 in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew by Professor Howard. All right, so let's take a look at the Hebrew Matthew. Could this be the passage that John was referring to there in 1 John chapter 2 of "you have heard that the Antichrist has already come and is coming"? So what Jesus is explaining in context of Matthew 24 are these events that are going to occur before the temple falls, and among those he's going to lead up to it. And just as he's going to tell you about the abomination that desolates the temple, we'll see what desolated the temple before 70 AD in this episode. He says, so this is the Antichrist, and this is the abomination that desolates, which was spoken of by Daniel as standing in the holy place. Let the one who reads understand. So Jesus clearly used the word Antichrist in the Hebrew Matthew. And why can we rely upon that? Number one, John refers to, you've heard this already. So you've been told this, and this would be corroboration of that. Without this, it looks like John doesn't have any biblical reference that he can make use of. So this makes sense that way. But the other thing is, it's very clear in context that Jesus is talking about somebody's going to bring apostasy, and there's going to be false Christs. People are going to say they're me, but they're not me, and he's warning about all this. But he pins the word Antichrist to the temple destruction, and that's what we're focusing on here today, because that means the Antichrist or an Antichrist or Antichrist, all of them have to occur before the temple falls. And that's an important part of prophecy, an important part of testing Paul. Who is he listening to? Since it has to be, this Antichrist has already appeared by the fall of the temple. When you read this verse, that means this verse unlocks who and likely is the voice of the Antichrist. And our position, my argument, is that it has to be the Jesus who Paul meets on the road to Damascus, because it fits everything. And just be patient and listen to the evidence of that. You may disagree, and then let me know. But you need to hear the case for it first. Now, I wanted to show you the actual screenshot of the book of Professor Howard. You can see there, it says, this is the Antichrist, and this is the abomination which desolates, which was spoken of by Daniel as standing in the holy place. Let the one who reads understand. Then those who are in Judah, let them flee to the mountains. So that's the other thing. A lot of people misunderstand Jesus and try to say, oh, well, he thought the end of the world was coming. No, he doesn't think this is the end of the world. He thinks this is the temple falling. He's asked 3 questions, one of which is, when will this temple fall? And then he tells this, this is what you need to look for. You're going to see this Antichrist. That will be the sign that he's coming, and that this abomination will come. And you'll see it's directly connected. The same events involving Paul and the temple fall. Here's the title page of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. It's worthy of purchasing. Now, what is the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew? Well, it's a very well-known fact that the original church maintained the Gospel of Matthew in the library at Caesarea. Even Eusebius mentions this, and it was in his hometown of Caesarea. So he had been apparently there and had seen it and all of that. And you have Jerome going there and spending weeks translating it into Greek and Latin. And for some reason, his manuscripts are destroyed. But did he believe they were not valid? Absolutely, he thought they were valid because he uses the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew to correct errors in his own translation into Latin of the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew. So he could see in it all the fact of how it was originally worded, and he could make an adjustment in Latin to reflect what he or some Greek translator before Jerome had made slight errors. And there are slight errors in the Greek translation. And one of the reasons we know that the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that the professor is looking at is authentic is the passage where it says John the Baptist ate locusts. Well, if you look at the Hebrew Matthew, see the word there is manna. When you translate manna into Greek, if you use the Greek Septuagint as an example, the Greek word there is one letter different from the word locust. So had it been translated correctly into honeycakes, it would have had a one letter difference from what it now read and has read since this mistranslation. It's been read ever since as locust, when in addition, obviously reading this, you can see the original Hebrew word was manna. Somebody made a translation error and put in, I think it's agris becomes locust when it should have been egris, which should be manna or honeycakes or pancakes. Okay, so clearly this book proves itself actually that it is the authentic original because we know of that mistake early on. Okay. And there we are. The Antichrist is the key word here. Okay. Now, Vincent is a very famous, Marvin Vincent, very famous study, did a very famous study called Word Studies in the New Testament. And he breaks down his volumes based on what books he's looking at. And here he's looking at the writings of John, including the Gospel, the Epistles, and the Apocalypse, which is Revelation. And this is in 1905. This is what he's going to say about Antichrist. And he says it's peculiar to John in the New Testament. But as I just showed you, no, that's how it's come to us. There's been dropouts and things that were removed, maybe deliberately. Oh, and I forgot to mention, where is the Hebrew Matthew? Why do we think it's authentic otherwise? Because in the 1300s, the kings of Aragon and Spain both demanded that the Hebrew scholars in the midst would defend Judaism against Christianity, and they wanted to hear Jewish arguments against Christianity. They told them basically, if you win, you got to be careful because you could be subject to death penalty. So don't go too far. But we want to hear your arguments. For whatever reason, they thought this was blood sport they could enjoy, and they would put their Christian scholars to the test and make them battle the Jewish scholars and see if they got beaten, and then they could either get rid of those scholars or get better scholars or whatever. Anyway, it was it was an exercise, but it was deadly to the Jewish scholars. If they actually won, they would be there were some consequences, and that happened to one of them. He was exiled from his country where he was living in Spain to Jerusalem. Anyway, so that's why we know there's an authentic original here, because these Jewish scholars said, hey, let's go to the community and ask them. We've been maintaining this Hebrew gospel from the very beginning, so we would always know what the Jewish people, the Christian people are saying. So they had actually maintained it, and they go, scurrying through all the communities they possibly can to find the recovery of this material. And this is what they all pulled together, and they created what's called the Shem Tov. And I think there's about 26 different editions. So they kept amending it as they're getting ready for these debates. And that's why, they had to do this out of self-defense, so they would know what our positions were. And that also means they're not deliberately themselves ever changing this to corrupt our own scriptures against us or anything like that. They're trying to win an argument, and they have to have what we would accept as legitimate scripture. And they're assuming a Greek translator did a good job. The Jewish scholars probably don't know Greek, so they can't test any of this against the Greek text. They're just going to argue from their Hebrew text of Matthew against the Christian scholars. So this is a very perfect crucible of preservation that God ordained, if you ask me. This is a very reliable text that you can trust that they're not going to corrupt it, because that would defeat the whole purpose. If they made up changes, they're not going to win the argument. They're not going to win the argument because the text is so different. So anyway, here's what Vincent, he's a doctor of divinity, in his word study on 1 John chapter 2, verse 18, he says this: Antichrist then is one who opposes Christ in the guise of Christ. So this one who comes is going to say, I am Jesus, but he's actually, it's a disguise. He's using the name, he's using Jesus' name. He's going to make people think he's really Jesus, but he really isn't. This is so perfect. This is so simply put, and it's so 100% correct. Now, let's look at Acts 22. Are we looking at an antichrist in disguise of Jesus, a bright light who says, I am Jesus to Paul? So just, you have to be open to testing. So just see, go with me for the moment. You can disprove it if you want later, but listen to the evidence and then disprove it. Okay. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and I heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Pause. What's going on here? He's in front of a crowd of people who've accused him of having brought in a Gentile named Trophimus into the temple, who desecrates the temple by going past the middle wall of separation. The Jews of Asia want to kill him, want to have him arrested, and the Romans have basically stepped in front of Paul because he says, I'm a citizen of Rome, and then Paul says, I'd like to talk to the crowd. So Paul is saying this in a loud voice to a lot of people, and presumably, honestly, this is his most likely truest account, because Acts 26, you'll see. It just, but anyway, let's not go there for the moment. Um, verse 8, who are you, Lord? And of course, I want to make a translation comment. The word Lord would suggest does he think it's the Lord, meaning the Lord master, his teacher, that kind of Lord? Or is he using it in the sense of sir, which the word Kyrios was used when you met a new person, you didn't know him? Just like we say in Italian, Signore, what do you want? Signore means Lord in Italian. So we say Signore to anyone we meet who's new. It doesn't mean we think they're God. It just means we think, or, even our master. There just simply is a word of respect. And even in English, sir means exactly Signore. It's a loan word from Italian, actually, into English. So there you go. This does not mean Lord there. It means sir. Who are you, sir? He doesn't know who he is yet. He hasn't identified himself yet, right? So he doesn't know if it's Jesus or not Jesus or whatever. I asked, I am Jesus. So the response comes, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. He replied, my companions saw the light, but they did not understand of him who was speaking to me. Continued. What shall I do, sir? I asked. Get up, the Lord, sir. Now here's where Paul may be saying now, because now he thinks of him as his master, so supposedly, right? So he's going to say Lord now in the real sense of the word Lord, and a master, my teacher. Get up, the Lord, master, said, and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do. My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. Now, by the way, I call it the 28 words that have duped the world. That's what I believe this is. And I mean, it duped Paul, because Jesus said this would the coming of the false Christ who would come in my name, say they're me. You'd meet him in a wilderness place or whatever. That's not going to be me. Once I ascend into heaven, which has already happened in Acts chapter 1, once I ascend into heaven, I'm not coming back to visit anyone in some desert place or wilderness road or private room. And if anybody says they saw me that way, it's not me, because when you see me ever again on earth, it's because every eye on me has seen me and I've returned. That's not happened here, ladies and gentlemen. So Paul doesn't know that passage, and he clearly is. This can't be the real Jesus, because Jesus already told you, I'm not coming back this way. That's just a fact of life. Just live with it and move on. Go back to Jesus and stop listening to Paul, because he's duped. And Jesus said it would be such a seductive presentation of himself that even a believer could be duped, if that were possible. Is Paul a believer at this point? Absolutely not. He's a blasphemer by his own definitions. He's been beating up Christians, hurting them. He's definitely not a Christian when this is happening. Does he become a Christian? That's a good question. If Satan were got in a disguise of Jesus, saying, "I am Jesus," on a road to Damascus, when Jesus said, "I'm not coming back that way until the second coming," you would know this can't be Jesus. So a true Christian could never have been duped like this. But somebody who doesn't know the words of Jesus is going to be duped, could be duped. Now, where prior to John, 1 John 2:18, did Christians hear the Antichrist is coming guise of Jesus, as Vincent says? Okay, so what Vincent was saying is the voice that somebody's going to hear is going to be in guise of Jesus. So let's look at the word guise as it's defined in the Google gives you definitions. Guise means an external form, appearance, or manner of presentation, typically concealing the true nature of something. He visited in the guise of an inspector. So what clearly Vincent is saying is exactly what we just saw with Paul in Acts 22. Somebody's going to say, "I am Jesus," and it's going to be in a bright light. Paul, if he even had ever seen Jesus, can't see enough of him to know or recognize if it's the same person he ever saw from a distance or whatever. And we don't know that he ever saw Jesus prior. But I'm just saying, this Jesus, whoever he is putting it in such a way that Paul can't even identify what he looks like. If somebody said, "What does he look like?" and nobody can help him confirm that this was really Jesus. It's all in a bright light. Okay. Now, what is the consequence that when Paul gets arrested in Acts 21, it's because his friend Trophimus from Ephesus ended up defiling the temple? What does that mean? So let's look at Ezekiel 44, verse 7. "In that ye have brought into my sanctuary strangers, uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh, to be in my sanctuary, to pollute it, even my house, when you offer my bread, the fat and the blood, and they have broken my covenant because of all your abominations." So God speaks of bringing in Gentiles into the temple in an uncircumcised state. And there's a holy area of the temple. There's a place called the court of the Gentiles, where the Gentiles are more than welcome to come, but they cannot cross this middle wall of partition, or otherwise they violated the holiest place of sanctity if they're uncircumcised. If they're circumcised, they can they can go all the way in to that part of the temple. So this is important because Jesus uses what words we saw here? This is the Antichrist, and this is the abomination that desolates, which was spoken by Daniel as standing in the holy place. Somebody's going to be standing in the holy place who abominates the temple, and we know that happens in Acts 21 with Trophimus. And we're going to go through that now real quick. Now, here's the heading. Paul teachings on circumcision did away with the command that Gentile must be circumcised to enter beyond the middle wall of partition at the temple into the sacred area of the temple. So what's the proof of that? So bear with me. First, 1 Corinthians 7:19 says that circumcision is nothing. Second, based upon that principle, Paul said, erroneously, as we shall see, "Is any called an uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised." 1 Corinthians 7:18. That's false, because the law didn't go away that you can't enter the temple uncircumcised. Paul, though, is implying otherwise. Third, nothing Jesus said did away with the command in Ezekiel 44:9 that any Gentile who wished to cross the middle wall of partition had to be circumcised, or otherwise the temple suffers an abomination. So this is actually a second time God says the same thing I quoted you from the verses prior to 44:9. Now, by the way, that's a picture of Trophimus to the right. He's become a saint, this guy who defiled God's temple. Do you think he should be called a saint for defiling God's temple? I don't think so, but I could be wrong. Lastly, Paul taught the Ephesians, like Trophimus, that God. Now, I got to back up. Trophimus is from Ephesus. This is in a town on what we call modern Western Turkey, and Ephesus was the capital city. And when you cross further to the left on a map, you go further west, you would see the Aegean Sea, and you'd cross over into Greece and Athens and so on. So this is a area that is very influenced by Greek, and they speak Greek. Lastly, Paul taught the Ephesians, like Trophimus, that God, quote, has broken down the middle wall of partition. He's referring to the temple. At the temple, quote, having abolished in his flesh the law of commandments contained in ordinances. Ephesians 2, verses 14 to 15, NIV. So this is exactly what Trophimus would have heard. That middle wall of partition really doesn't apply anymore. I can just walk through there. That doesn't matter anymore. Forget about the death penalty sign above my head. I'm gonna enjoy myself. I'm gonna do what I want. That's somebody you're gonna call a saint. Really amazing. Now, by the way, God knew completely what was going to happen when Paul went to Jerusalem. First, Luke was with Paul on the journey where Paul decided to go to Jerusalem with his Ephesian friend Trophimus. God told Paul, according to Luke, through a known prophet of God, Agabus, and several other believers who God spoke to, they all claimed we had the Holy Spirit tell us something, that Paul was not to make this journey to Jerusalem, Acts 21, verse 4, but that, as Luke himself records, Paul deliberately disobeyed God. He said, in my spirit, I want to go. He didn't say God's spirit told me I have to go. He said, in my spirit, I just feel I must go. That's in Acts 21, verse 17. Second, Trophimus heard Paul's words that the, quote, God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. That's Acts 17:24. So if Trophimus heard this, Trophimus could conclude, because God does not truly live at the Jerusalem temple, and he could enter that temple unworried about being uncircumcised. Many reasons why Trophimus would make this decision to walk through. All right. Now, what about the controversy about this? So scholars rarely will tell you when you're reading summaries that this actually happened, right? They'll just do everything they can to obscure it and not mention what I'm telling you. But listen to the full context, and they never put everything in context so you can figure it out. Neither Luke nor Paul ever denied Trophimus defiled the temple. That's key, because that's what the scholars try to imply or construe out of it, that he denied that defilement never happened. That's not what he denies. He denies that he was with him when it happened. Let's keep going here. Instead, both Luke and Paul merely tried to deny there was proof that Paul had brought Trophimus into the prohibited area. Acts 21, verse 29, Acts 24, verse 6, 13 and 18, Acts 25, verses 7 to 8. Luke says the Jews, quote, supposed Paul had done so because they earlier saw Paul together with Trophimus in Jerusalem, Acts 21, verses 28 to 29. Trophimus was indeed a close companion of Paul. See Acts 20, verse 4, 2 Timothy 4, verse 20. Yet Paul said his accusers merely found him, Paul, purifying himself in the temple, Acts 24:18. So basically, his alibi is during the time that defilement happened, I'm not there. I'm over here. I'm doing a ceremonial bath. That means he's not denying that Trophimus committed the offense that they were all claiming. He's saying, I wasn't there. And they're saying, hey, you're responsible that he came in here and we're going to blame you. He says, how can you blame me? I'm not even there. Let's continue. This was the only inadequacy Paul cited to the charge that he, Paul, was responsible for Trophimus profaning the temple. See Acts 21, verse 28, where Paul says, where the accusation is, Paul, quote, brought Greeks also into the temple and defiled this holy place. So do you see, the defilement is a fact. Whether Paul brought him in or not was the disputed fact. And that's technically legitimate. If he's in a ceremonial bath, he didn't bring him into walk him through that middle wall of partition, but he has all the responsibility possible that you can imagine from all the things he said, as we showed you, including telling the people of Ephesus in a letter to the Ephesians that the middle wall of partition has been taken down by God as he has abolished all these ordinances. Okay? And we're talking about God's word is being abolished, according to Paul. Now, next. It was this charge in Acts 24, verse 6, profane the temple. The Jews of Asia come up and say, he has profaned the temple, which Paul appealed to Caesar. So that is the charge. That's the only crime he's committed that the Romans have to look at. They don't have any, people say he attacked the law or whatever. That it doesn't matter. The Romans just want to know, did you break our law? That's the law we have adopted to enforce the temple sanctity ourselves so we can hold people accountable and placate the Jewish people. Okay, next continue. This is why Paul was being taken to Rome by Roman authorities. Acts 25, verses 8 to 11. Paul acknowledges is the issue when he disclaims his innocence in Acts 25, verse 8. Then Paul made his defense, quote, I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. And so if you look at all of those things, they're all the same thing. The law of the Jews is you can't bring an uncircumcised Gentile into the holy area beyond the middle wall of partition. So that's the law of the Jews. And also, he says, I didn't do anything against the temple. Well, that law specifically is about the temple. And he says, I didn't violate any law of Caesar, which is to basically, the law says is you cannot even pass under this wall of middle partition yourself. So he didn't do that. So he's innocent of all charges. That's his statement. Now, I think had the magistrate judge, which is Theophilus, according to Mr. Mauch's research and Mr. Hauptmann's research in the 1720s, that this is all a brief. The book of Acts is a brief to give Nero to help win a victory for Paul at trial, because that would boomerang on Christianity. Is we have clear evidence that what it all is boiling down to is this: can Paul win the appeal? And this is the defense right there in that one sentence. The only Christian resource that says plainly what Paul was charged with at this trial and this appeal is Bible History Online in the article entitled The Court of the Gentiles. And let's listen to what they say, because frankness is very rare in this topic. Let me just put it that way. The uncircumcised Gentiles could walk within it, i.e. the court of the Gentiles, but they were forbidden to go any further than the outer court. That's where the court of Gentiles are, unless they were circumcised. He doesn't mention in his article. They were excluded from entering any of the inner courts of the temple, again, if they're uncircumcised. And warning signs were placed that the penalty for such trespass was death. It was for this alleged crime that Paul was attacked and nearly beaten to death by an angry crowd during his last visit to Jerusalem, Acts 21, verse 27 to 32. Again, Paul is being accused of inviting or taking Trophimus beyond that middle wall of partition, but it's not an alleged crime. It's a fact that Trophimus committed this crime. It's just a question whether Paul is guilty of the same crime for having brought Trophimus into the temple area, or bringing him into the environments close enough that Trophimus could wander away and do this. So I think it could have been a social construct in that era that if you were a Jewish person, you brought a Gentile in, you can't let him out of your sight, because what if he did exactly what Trophimus does? There might have been a sense of responsibility you have, and so the Jewish people might be trying to enforce that principle that would be in their law, but maybe Roman law doesn't have the same principle. So there's that ambiguity of, would the Romans follow the Jewish interpretation of how you could violate this if you were Paul? Okay, yet for very obvious reasons, this aspect of what Paul was being put on trial for is rarely openly discussed in Christian churches or histories. Research for yourself the words Trophimus Online. Just see if you see how many will tell you the truth. Okay, so again, this all ties back into who is the Antichrist. The Antichrist has to be coming before the temple is desolated, because that's the Antichrist becomes the abomination. He finds a way to abominate the temple of God. And that is exactly what the person leading Paul along on a string does by teaching Paul that circumcision is nothing, and circumcision has been done away with, in the middle wall of separation, the temple has been done away with, all these things, and that God does not live in temples made of human hands, all these things. If Trophimus heard all these things, he would absolutely, with impunity, have no regard for the sanctity of the temple, and just walk right through wherever he wanted. Middle wall separation, let's go. Let's find some fun over there. That looks interesting to me. That's what he did. And apparently it's like there's no inspectors immediately going to catch you, or there's such crowds that you could just weasel your way through, and you find out later you're Jewish people. You can be like, gosh, this guy's defiled our temple. What crazy person is this? And that's what Jesus is warning about. The Antichrist is coming, and he will bring an abomination to the temple. And I'm not saying Paul's the Antichrist. I'm saying the Christ, exactly what Vincent is saying. The Antichrist is someone who's going to say he's Jesus, is going to come in the guise of Jesus. He himself is not the true Jesus, but he'll deceive many that he is the true Jesus. Exactly what happened to Paul. And it has to be, because it has to be somebody who pre-existed the fall of 70 AD, and that's Paul. Paul actually dies before 70 AD. All right, God bless everybody. Take care. And wait, don't miss the next episode, because now we're going to show you and limit things. We're going to show you how the temple violation has to occur, and that will define who is the Antichrist, because there is no Antichrist ever mentioned anywhere after Matthew 24. There is nothing in the book of Revelation that suggests that the Antichrist is even being depicted there. So this is why you can narrow down who is the Antichrist, who are the Antichrist spirits that John is referring to, and therefore you can narrow down even further. Therefore, there's no chance to even look anywhere past this period. Once the temple falls, you will have had the identity of the Antichrist revealed. It's just, do people look? Do people care? Do people want to test what the events are there, and then say, hey, Jesus did, his words became fulfilled, and therefore this is just another prophecy of Jesus Christ that comes amazingly true, and more proof that Jesus is the prophet of God. All right, God bless. Take care, everyone. Ciao, bye.